welcome John Hood. He's a true North Carolina legend. And before I just go into his background a little bit more depth than that, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about our organization. By the way, today is Wednesday, June 11th, 2025, and this is the Horowitz Salons Raleigh. We are affiliated with the American Institute of Economic Research, and we used to be the Bastiat Society of Raleigh, named after Frederick Bastiat, the economist and polemicist of the 19th century. And now we're named after Colonel Harwood, who started the American Institute of Economic Research as a way to push back against the New Deal and socialism. And I personally worked with Richard Salzman, professor at Duke, and also a number of other people on our steering committee, including Michael Munger, to start this organization as a pushback against what I perceived, and a lot of us perceived as major socialism going on in the Biden administration and before that. And in fact, the John Locke Foundation, which John Hood was the president of, was one of our early sponsors and helped us get started. Anyway, just a little background on the fact that was in 2021, and we had so much success that AIER decided to take us on and sponsor us more directly among 4 in the entire world. And that was pretty cool because we had only started in 2021. So here we are. We are sustained by donations from people like yourselves. It's really so satisfying for me to see that we have a kind of a family here. It's really cool. I got George Abel, who's now helping to set things up, and it's just things feel smoother. And we also want to thank McGregor Downs very much. So, John Hood. I say he's kind of a heroic figure, at least I think a lot of people believe that. He is basically, he's a journalist, he's a columnist, he's a professor at Duke. He was the president of the John Locke Foundation. He's now the president of the John William Pope Foundation. And I just found out today, because I was looking a little bit more carefully, he's also a dancer, like extraordinaire, tap dancer. This guy, he's got it going. Thank you very much, John, for coming to speak with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brad. I appreciate that very kind introduction, which I wrote. Kind of. Delighted to be with you tonight. Delighted to see that the Harwood Salon program is still going strong. It's important for those who believe in freedom, constitutional government, the rule of law, and all the other principles we'll talk about tonight, not only espouse those principles, but get together with other people who share those principles and figure out ways to promote and strengthen them. As I look around the audience, I see some people I just met, people I look forward to meeting after the talk, and I also see some folks that I will not call them old friends, because that seems kind of insulting. So I will say they are people with whom I am an old friend, or former colleague. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Freedom Conservatism, a project that I was involved in creating a couple of years ago, why it happened, how it happened, what we're trying to do. A lot of the principles of Freedom Conservatism will sound familiar to you. Many of you have shared them, espoused them yourselves for decades. But the term Freedom Conservatism is newer. I want to tell you a little bit about how we came up with that, the origin story of that. Then I'm going to go through, we have 10 principles in the Freedom Conservatism statement, and I'm going to talk you through each of those principles and explain a little bit about what we were thinking when the committee put them together. It was written by a committee, and I've made sure to recruit a variety of different people as part of the process of writing the Freedom Conservatism statement, some of whom I had known for decades, and some young people that I had only just met. We wanted lots of people to feel invested, bought in to the statement. No one person wrote all the language or is even probably comfortable with every word or phrase of the statement. but as a whole, we think it captures very well a conception of American conservatism that is vibrant, that is time-tested, that is appealing, and it is under threat. And that's why we worked so hard on this project. So, the origin story is really simple, or at least the version I'm going to tell you is simple. As was said, I was at the John Locke Foundation for a long time, and even before that, I worked in the media, and I spent a lot of time thinking about names and brands. Created some of them. A few of them still exist because they were good brands. Some of them I'm thankful that no one remembers. Roy probably remembers. But we came up with a few ideas, Roy, that didn't really sell, and those brands have gone by the wayside. But it turns out that whether it's marketing products, services, freedom, you cannot escape the incredibly important choice of words. What labels do you use? I got concerned some years ago as what I think you all recognize, lots of dissent and debate and disagreement about what the American right is or was or should be. I got concerned that those who wanted to reconceptualize it in a more statist, big government, nationalist, populist way had some language that had some cachet. And the response from those who wanted to defend American conservatism, as I would argue, as it originated long ago, we said things like it originated long ago. Or, I'm a Calvin Coolidge, or a Ronald Reagan. And that people meant well when they did that, but of course what that really sounds like is you're backward, you're yesterday's news, you're trapped in the past, you think we're still dealing with the problems of the 1970s. Though I would observe that we are in fact dealing with the problems of the 1970s. We have a burst of inflation, we have all sorts of problems around the world, we have regulation at home, we have a lot of the same problems that conservatives dealt with in the 1970s when the supply side revolution occurred. So history does rhyme, as they say, but using terms that felt dated. I mean, after all, again, no offense to those of you who still work there or used to work at the John Locke Foundation. I certainly did, and I was involved in choosing that name, but it does refer to somebody who's been dead for 300 years. Though occasionally, all throughout my tenure there, we would get calls asking to speak to Mr. Locke, which is a sad commentary on the knowledge of American and English history. Anyway, so I wrote a piece for National Review. I've been writing for National Review for a long time. The editor of National Review, Rich Lowry, I met him in college. I was editing a libertarian magazine at Chapel Hill. He was editing a conservative magazine at University of Virginia. And so we went on editors' meetings. North Carolina, Virginia are neighbors, so they would stick us together as roommates. So we got to know each other, arguing long into the night about all sorts of things, but agreeing on most everything. So I've been writing for Rich's magazine for a long time at National Review. Some years ago, I decided to write about this topic of labels, that we needed a different label. And I spent a lot of the time writing the article, critiquing all the possible alternatives. We had something crop up called national conservatism, which is one of the conceptions of the right that with which we have a problem. Even though I didn't like their term and I don't like their principles, most of them, it was handy because you could say not kind. And so we need something kind. So I wrote an article and I came up with a lot of different options. Like I sort of liked, we're Americans. And then it occurred to me that I would say it like every time, Jen, I would say, we're Americans, and you would laugh at me, and everybody else would laugh at me, and that was not a good idea, all right? So then I thought, well, you know, what we're trying to do, actually, and what I think American conservatism, modern American conservatism of the 20th and 21st century was always doing was conserving the classical liberalism of the American founding. So we could be classic cons. We could be lib cons, which was a horrible idea, obviously. That's just inviting someone to rhetorically or maybe literally punch you in the face. You're a lib con. So, thought about it some more. What do we stand for? Liberty. Well, again, that takes us back to lib con. I always like the term freedom a little better anyway, because it has sort of Mel Gibson-ish freedom. Liberty sounds French, no offense, but it's sort of like a German sound. So, end up pitching in the article freedom conservatism, because freedom is one of the principles that Americans should be conserving. Now, of course, it isn't the only one, and you can see in the statement that we go beyond talking strictly just about liberty. But we start with it. We start with it in part because the American founding started with the conception of the individual having rights. I seem to remember something about endowed by your creator with certain inalienable rights. Of course, in the original document, they have a grammatical error. It should be inalienable, but they call it unalienable. I mean, you know, occasionally Scribner errors stick with us. So it starts with that, but it's not limited to it. We do see liberty as indispensable to America and to an American conservative movement. It has been successful and could ever be successful at creating the conditions for people to flourish in our country. But it's not limited to that. We believe American greatness is impossible without American freedom. It's not just good marketing, it's sound principle. But it's not sufficient. There's some other values as well. I'll talk about the statement. We have 10 statement of principles. And I would argue that a lot of these principles are mutually reinforcing. One goes well with the other, and it's difficult to sustain in the absence of the others. Individual liberty, I would submit, historically, cannot be conserved in the absence of social institutions that inculcate virtue, tame ambition, deter corruption, reward enterprise, foster community, comfort the afflicted, and nourish the soul. Now, I'm in good company in believing that, and I'm going to start by quoting a fellow named John Locke. We still like him around here, right? In his second treatise, Locke wrote that God bestowed on parents the authority and responsibility to prepare a child to flourish in a free society for, quote, to turn him loose to an unrestrained liberty before he has reason to guide him, is not allowing him the privilege of his nature to be free, but is to thrust him out among brutes and abandon him to a state as wretched and as much beneath that of a man as theirs. John Locke, patron saint of the liberty movement, argued that children needed to be reared, that they were not naturally born possessing virtues and behaviors and self-discipline that would not only serve them well, but help them sustain the very liberty that is their birthright. That's what John Locke argued, and I think we're in pretty good company. Edmund Burke famously wrote of the little platoons that we do not choose, and yet form the germ of public affections. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about Americans forever forming associations, and said that, quote, in democratic countries, knowledge of how to combine is the mother of all other forms of knowledge. On its progress depends that of all the others. Knowledge of how to combine, how to create voluntary associations. Russell Kirk, famous conservative, wrote that, quote, customs, convention, and old prescription are checks for the lust for power. Friedrich Hayek wrote that civilization depends on, quote, certain traditional and largely moral practices, many of which men tend to dislike, whose significance they usually fail to understand, and whose validity they cannot prove. Now, this is our Austrian economist par excellence arguing there's certain traditions, certain knowledge that is embedded in tradition that is valuable. It's proven its value over time through generations. We can't rationally, carefully calculate, pull it all apart, put it on a chart. And it's something we need to respect because it is useful in a free society. So what do we affirm? Here's what I wrote in a piece for National Review a little bit more recently. It said, freedom conservatives believe in free markets, free trade, free speech, strong families, balanced budgets, peace through strength, and the rule of law. We champion equal protection and equal opportunity. We think Washington has too much power and that our states, communities, associations, and families have too little power. Now, NatCons and other nationalist populist voices share some of these positions, but unfortunately not nearly enough of them. It is our task to agree with people on the right or the left, to agree with us on the principles when that happens, but to challenge them when they differ from us on such matters as trade policy, business subsidies, pluralism, and the devolution of government power. Now, I'm not going to argue that all the freedom conservatism, we have more than 300 signatories, including some of the people in this room, who have signed the freedom conservatism statement. We have lots of people on that list. And if we chose a particular subject, abortion, the war in Ukraine and what America should do, if anything, in response to it, we're going to have some disagreements. We know that. We built that into our concept that we're a coalition of people who have enough in common to work together, but obviously have some differences of opinion about how to apply these principles in particular cases. I'm going to talk you through each of these 10 principles. And of course, we start with liberty. It is indivisible, we state, and political freedom cannot long exist without economic freedom. You can go to our Substack, which is freedomconservatism.org, and you can see all of the statements. And in fact, you can see some of the evidence that we have assembled as to why you cannot have a flourishing society unless it is devoted to the principle, the inviolable principle of individual liberty. Only in such places do economies grow strong, grow lovely, and free people grow happier. Now, our second, speaking of which, our second principle is the pursuit of happiness. Here's the way we put it. Most individuals are happiest in loving families, within stable and prosperous communities, in which parents are free to engage in meaningful work and to raise and educate their children according to their values. Let me just note a few things about that statement. First of all, there's a modifier, most, because that is the default that is best for most people. There are going to be exceptions. There are going to be people who go into the priesthoods, they're not going to get married, and lots of other exceptions. But as a general rule, this is the way healthy societies are sustained. In fact, we argue that social ills, many social ills, maybe most of them, lie downstream from the decline of both nuclear families and extended families, as well as the erosion of their influence by government itself. One of our signatories, Charles Murray, who you may be familiar with, has been writing very eloquently about this problem for more than half a century. There's a vicious cycle. Government welfare programs weaken the incentive to marry and to bear children within that marriage. Other entitlements weaken the ties between adults and their elderly parents, because the suggestion is the government will take care of your parents when they grow old. You're substituting cash and contractors for caring relationships. That displaces family just as much as the more familiar argument the government welfare programs affect out-of-wedlock births and family formation. Two other things I want to underline. One, freedom to work, the right to work. I'm not big fans of labor unions. The second is for parents to choose how their children will be educated. We consider the fights against educational monopolies and against compulsory unionism to be excellent examples of freedom conservatism in action. Now, our third principle is, we call it the foundation of prosperity. Now, according to exit polls, the top priority last fall for most voters was bringing down the cost of living. And in our statement, our third principle, we say, we pledge to reduce the cost of living through competitive markets, greater individual choice, and free trade with free people, while upholding the rule of law, freedom of contract, and freedom of association. We had one of my friends criticize and say, you don't have property rights in there. I mean, we can't have every single name-checked phrase in there. I think it's implied by freedom of contract association. But yes, property rights as well. And you notice we have a proviso. We say free trade, but we say free trade with free nations. This was a source of some dispute, some discussion among the committee about free trade. And we were trying to figure out a way to convey that we're for free trade, and we recognize there could be some exceptions, like during wartime, or again, in sensitive technologies or resources. If you're purchasing those for potential enemies, that could be a national security problem. Adam Smith, in fact, talks about that in his own work in The Wealth of Nations. He talks about national security being a legitimate concern. Of course, that doesn't mean our national security, our vital bodily fluids, livelihoods are threatened by, importing mineral water or socks or something from somewhere else. But it is a significant commitment and obviously relevant to a lot of the debates we're seeing today. In fact, on many of those subjects, we find ourselves in conflict with the progressive left, of course, and also with the populist right. Trade, regulation, there's a variety of examples. Our fourth principle is entitled full faith and credit. And of course, this is a play on words. We're not actually talking about like you're married in Ohio, then you respect your marriage in Kentucky. I mean, I'm for that, I guess. But that's not really what we're talking about. This is a bit of a play on words. What we're talking about is runaway federal spending, chronic budget deficits, and the threat they pose, not just to our economy, not just to personal responsibility, but indeed to our freedoms. We want to restore America's credit. That's what full faith and credit, that's our play on words. We want to restore the public's faith in a budget process and in leaders who follow it so that, quote, future generations inherit a more prosperous and secure nation than the one we now inhabit. This is a timely concern, because we have a bill that is moving through Congress that has a lot of good things in it, things that I support, as well as an expansion of the federal deficit. Claims that no economic growth will make up the difference are fallacious. The Tax Foundation, one of our allies on this, just ran some numbers, and absolutely there will be a feedback loop. Additional growth will increase the tax base, and it will maybe replace 20-30% of the revenue loss and the deficits created by excessive spending. I'm all for cutting taxes. We need to cut spending more so that we are actually reducing our indebtedness over time, not increasing. Again, we're arguing on this with the progressive left. I mean, right now they pretend to care about deficits, but they never did. And we're arguing with the populist right. Now, we know the progressive left believes, oh, sure, we can afford all this stuff. We can afford Medicare for all. All we have to do is tax the wealthy. When they actually mean that, like the actual wealthy, they're either confused or lying, because you couldn't get nearly enough money to close the deficit by taxing the actual wealthy, even at 50, 60, 70%, because first of all, you would in fact chase money into tax shelters. But there's just not enough money. Now, what they really mean, most of the time, if they're being intellectually honest, but not explicitly honest, is people who make above the median household income. We're going to heavily tax them. Well, in theory, you probably could tax them enough to balance the budget until they realize their tax rates, 40%, 50%. That's not going to work either. Unfortunately, the populist right, some of them say, well, yeah, maybe the wealthy need to pay higher taxes. Steve Bannon's position, that is Josh Hawley's position, apparently. And so on this matter, again, we're dealing with critics who say they're on different sides of the ideological fence that sound remarkably similar. Big government is good, entitlement should be protected. Maybe the problem is that we're undertaxed. We do not believe the problem is that we're undertaxed. We believe that we're spending too much. Number 5, a nation of laws, not men. This is our rule of law plank, our administrative state plank, our insistence that conservatives appoint and confirm judges who will enforce the separation of powers, checks and balances, and equality before the law. I would argue we're making some progress here, Supreme Court decisions and lots of other things, but also there are continuing threats to the separation of powers. And unfortunately, from the progressive left, i.e. President Biden pretending he could just eliminate student loan debt, and unfortunately people who at least describe themselves as being on the right. Number 6, Americans by choice. This is our immigration proposition. And we affirm 2 propositions here. One is that, quote, immigration is the principal driver of American prosperity and achievement. The other proposition is, quote, a sovereign nation has the right to secure its borders and design a rational immigration policy that advances the interests and value of its citizens. We believe these goals are compatible. Another priority, if you look at the polls last fall for voters, was rationalizing the border, reducing the disorder at the border, having a process and following it. One can have a process And that process could respect the fact that immigration is a net good, and yet deter and reduce illegal immigration, people who have criminal records, people who have violated the law in other ways, all sorts of reasonable restrictions while respecting the value that immigration has always played in American life and continues to play in American life, but to do so legally. This is another area where we differ from the progressive left and the populist right. Progressive left, some of them have, I would describe as some valid concerns about how immigration enforcement is occurring right now, and their choice to express themselves is to riot. We're anti-riot. I'm going to go out on a limb. Y'all agree with me? We're anti-riot. So if you have some concerns about it, you make an argument, you try to persuade people you don't burn down somebody's house or break into somebody's house or turn a car over. Unfortunately, on the populist right, that's what they're saying now, but they didn't always say that either. Riots, it appears, are in the eye of the beholder. Number 7, this principle has been confusing Al Gore for a very long time. E pluribus unum, out of many one. Our country was born as a union of pre-existing polities. You know, North Carolina existed before there was a United States. By definition, the states existed and then they were united. Okay? So we formed a country, and we did form a nation. We do have a nation. It's not an ethnically based nation. We have a nation based on fundamental and commonly shared principles and values. And the federal government, the national government, was supposed to do only a few things. We think that was a good recipe then, and it is a good recipe now. And in fact, we are serious about devolving power. And when you're serious about devolving power, that means that if you hear about homeless camps in San Francisco or queer story hour in Minneapolis or something, you can have feelings about it, but unless you live in San Francisco or Minneapolis, you might just want to think they can take care of those problems in those communities, and we'll worry about things that are happening in our community, unless it is a truly national issue like national defense or something like that. Federalism cuts every which way. So we're pretty sticklers about this. We don't want the federal government telling us what to do. We also don't like states becoming so dependent on federal money. So this is not just something where the feds have encroached on the states. The states have been part, and the localities, been part of their own corruption. Ray is nodding because he edits American Habits, a journal about federalism. You should check out American Habits. Is it AmericanHabits.com?
.org.
.org.
I think .com will get you there too.
Either way, American Habits. You know one of the habits of Americans? Decentralizing power. All right. Number 8, America's promissory note. This is the one time when we quoted someone else explicitly in the statement. We quoted Martin Luther King Jr. and his notion of a promissory note. We argue, we commit ourselves to expanding opportunity for those who face challenges due to segregation or other government sins of the past. And we also affirm equal protection under the law because, again, we believe these things are consistent. How do we create opportunity for people who have been historically disadvantaged? By a lot of the policies that we're advocating, by school choice, by deregulating the economy, deregulating access to professions, deregulating the housing markets. Zoning was about segregation in the South and elsewhere. We should remember that. Or at least it was largely about segregation. Many of our organizations have been directly involved in challenging these practices of the past and advancing them in the future. Number 9, shining city on a hill. This is our foreign policy plank. See if you think we crafted this in a way that could encompass people who might disagree about some aspects of foreign policy. Here's what we said. American foreign policy must be judged by one criterion above all: its service to the just interests of the United States. Americans are safest and freest in a peaceful world led by the United States, in which other nations uphold individual liberty and the sovereignty of their neighbors. It doesn't commit us to gallivant around the globe looking for, as John Quincy Adams put it, monsters to slay, but it also doesn't. It's not incumbent upon us to pretend there aren't monsters, and to want to work with countries run by non-monsters, and to over time, through a variety of ways, expand our relationships with countries that share our values, or at least a lot of our values. We have some disagreements about how to apply that, but a good way to think about this is, you had a spectrum of foreign policy views between crusaders, engagers, restrainers, and abstainers, like all the way out here, do anything, all the way over here, Fortress America. We are a coalition of the engagers and the restrainers. We have practical conversations about exactly how to pursue the principles that we outlined, but we think the principles that have been outlined in this statement, lots of different kinds of people who are on the right, who believe in freedom, decide. Finally, number 10, freedom of conscience. We argue essential to a free society is the freedom to say and think what we believe to be true. Now, governments have a legal obligation, a constitutional obligation to protect that. We also think private associations, or at least some of them, have a moral obligation to protect freedom of conscience. Of course, there are organizations that are built around particular shared values, and we support that too. Now, are there people in our country who do not call themselves freedom conservatives, who believe in freedom of conscience and individual liberty and peace through strength, strong family? Of course. Part of the reason we're using this language in a fairly concise statement is because we are trying to encourage lots of different kinds of people who may call themselves different things to see something or many things in the statement that are attractive and that contrast with what they're being offered by the progressive left, a failed philosophy, and the populist nationalist right, also a failed philosophy. Now, how are we going to pursue our project? I'm going to end on this and then take your questions. There's three things that we are doing to advance the cause of freedom conservatism. We announced the project a couple of summers ago. We had our first Freedom Conservatism Conference in Washington in February. Some of you were there. What we plan to do is really three things. Number one, connecting. Number two, convening. And number three, convincing. So, connecting, we do have a network of more than 300 people who have signed the statement, who work in our movement in some capacity. Of course, we have many other people who support the statement, but we recruit signatories who are professors or writers or policy analysts who used to be governors or state legislators or staffers in local government or federal government. So lots of different kinds of people, litigators, activists, trainers, donors, working in our movement all across the country. And we continue to recruit new signatories, and we continue to convene conversations among them. So that second, convening, is important. Some of the convening is public. We had our conference, our initial conference in Washington in February. We're planning a follow-up conference, probably in Austin, Texas. You will see us go to Washington occasionally because that's where the national government is causing so much trouble. But we are not a movement of Washington. Obviously, we want to devolve power, and you will see that even in our events that we'll be having a lot of them in other places, including almost certainly in 26 or 27, a Freedom Conservatism Conference here in the Triangle. In addition to those public-facing events, we're doing lots of other small groups. When other groups of conservatives and libertarians and classical liberals meet, we have receptions, we have meetups, we get our signatories together when they're all going to be in the same place, like State Policy Network. Every year we have a gathering. We'll be doing that at other organizations and associations. Lots of convening, some of it in person, some of it through virtual means. We have regular Zoom calls, and in fact we also have some online groups where people compare notes, strategize, promote each other's work. Finally, convincing. We commission articles. Didn't think I'd be in the magazine business again, but I am editing well. There's someone that is editing the Freedom Conservatism site, and that person has been commissioning some original articles that you'll start to see on the site. In addition, we put out a weekly newsletter where we collect a lot of what people write and say about the issues Freedom Conservatives care about, who are themselves Freedom Conservative signatories or allies. So we're going to work on connecting more and more people who share these values, convening them in a way that we can compare notes, we can work on some difficult questions where we have some disagreements, try to work them out, figure out the best way to apply our principles to 21st century problems. And then our goal is to convince as many people as possible that this is a conception of American freedom, American conservatism, that reflects our best values, that reflects historical lessons, but is focused on the problems of today. So, do most freedom conservatives venerate Ronald Reagan? Sure. Do we venerate Calvin Coolidge? Yes. George Washington? Of course. Fill in all the various blanks that you all can fill in. Yes. But we're not going to call ourselves the conservatives who think a lot about 250 years ago. It's too long anyway. We are freedom conservatives. We are focused on applying timeless principles to today's problems, using today's language, today's people, today's opportunities. That's my position. I'm sticking to it until you persuade me otherwise. So now is the time in the show when I take your questions. I will take any question. I didn't say I would answer it. I just said I would take it. So I will provide answers, or I will dodge in a very tap dancey way, depending upon my whim or just how scary you look. All right? Who's going to go first? I'm shocked. Roy Cordova.
John, how do you think we got here? I feel like this is just plowing ground that's already been plowed, but it's been covered over.
Yes.
Going back to the Sharon statement, which you folks had mentioned, and
We
we
did.
have in the 60s, and Gold Water campaign and so on. I thought we did this already. And now here we are back having it feel like start all over again. I mean, free trade, for crying out loud. I take part of it, I don't personally, because I thought free trade really well. But so many of my colleagues teaching economics, I don't even know if they teach comparative advantage.
Because they thought it was a settled issue, do you think?
No, I think they get bogged down in equations.
Oh, okay.
And technical stuff where free trade can be explained pretty simply, and we don't want any of that. But anyway, how do you think we got here?
Well, I am tempted to say it's our fault, yours and mine. People who worked in the movement for a while, and we made our arguments and we wrote about these matters, but maybe we weren't persuasive enough. But I think that's a little too. That puts us too much on the hook, Roy. I think we need to get off the hook. I think the first thing we all have to recognize is that there will always be threats to the ideas I just described. Human nature is such. There will be people who want to be protected. People who get worried if there's a technological change. Maybe it will be good for most people, but it would be bad for me. And Andy and I figure out we're the only people in the room who are going to be hurt by this. We're going to lose our entire livelihood. So we will scheme and we will work very hard to convince people that it would be good to protect our two jobs. And everybody else who will pay a little bit more in prices because of that don't have the same incentives to organize. I think those basic public choice dynamics, basic human temptations and frailties will always be with us. And we should accept that. We should accept that even if this project is successful over the next, half dozen years, that it's not going to win a permanent victory either. And that, a couple hundred years into the future, when the Martian colony wants to put a tariff on asteroid miners who are bypassing Mars, they're going straight to the moon colony where the refining is happening, and the Martians are being cut out, and they're going to make some argument about safety or something. This is going to continue indefinitely. We have to always replenish the ranks of people who believe in our principles. We have to always reinvent and reestablish institutions that are good at cultivating them, good at talking about them. In a way, it's very frustrating, Roy, but it's also, we always knew that there's aspects of the freedom philosophy that come naturally to human beings. And there's aspects of it that don't, or at least that feel wrong, that don't comport with other temptations or drives that human beings have. To have a leader that establishes dominance, that being afraid and wanting somebody to help them because they're afraid of something. These are things I think we're just going to always have to grapple with. Yes, sir. I'll come back to Richard in a second.
What do you think Gen Zs have found in what you're speaking about tonight?
We have many young people who are very excited about freedom conservatism. They come to our events. As I said, I had several 20-somethings writing some of this language. I would have written some of this differently. But I wanted to make sure we were using language that's relevant to the way people are talking about these problems today. But yes, of course, there are also young people who find freedom, conservatism principles, they see them as outdated. They see them as failed because either they themselves have some problems in their life, failure to launch, having challenges in a career they weren't expecting. I have talked to a number of NatCon young men who reach out and argue with me, and when I push a little bit harder, they're very upset. They're disaffected about life. Many of them are lonely. Many of them feel unfulfilled. They unfortunately they believe they will be fulfilled in a movement where they find meaning in national greatness, in national action, being part of something that rebuilds the industrial base through tariffs and so forth. There is a faux, F-A-U-X, a faux sort of masculinity that they sense in national conservatism. It's very appealing to them. Now, there may be some young women in the movement who also find it appealing. They just haven't reached out to me yet. But I'm just giving you an example of some of this is nothing new. Some of this feels like the Luddites. It feels like other periods in the past where there's been technological change or economic change. People moving from the farms to the cities was disruptive. I wrote a whole book arguing that was a major reason why progressivism rose, because people were leaving farms and going to cities. They used to, even if they were in debt, they sort of felt like they provided their water. They grew food. They had capital they owned. They had cattle. They had oxes. They had farm implements. They went to the cities. They worked for somebody else. They were using capital somebody else owned. It was disquieting, disorienting. I think some of them found the progressive argument about this attractive. So that was in part an ideological argument. I think it was partly about social change, about people used to be in rural areas. This is a Jeffersonian sort of argument, that it is easier when people own capital, even if it's just their house, their farm, their business. Most people owned their own capital in America until about the 1880s, when they started to be living in cities, renting a house instead of renting an apartment instead of owning a homestead. And so today we also see lots of changes. Young people are responding to those changes. Some of those changes are very exciting. Some of them are scary. And unfortunately, a lot of these populist voices are taking advantage of that second part of it, the scariness, the disorienting feelings associated with the rise of artificial intelligence and automation, the changes in media and how we get information, from it being more local to being more national and international. It's not as much connection to where you live. And people are responding to that in a variety of ways, including unhealthy ways. We've got to figure out a way to reach them with our message. We recognize the problems they're dealing with. We're not going to tell them they don't exist. But what they're embracing is not going to solve any of those problems. It's going to make them worse. We're going to rebuild the industrial base by making it more expensive to import steel. Go talk to all these companies that use steel to make things. They are not adding jobs, they are losing jobs. So explaining that to the next generation, and really every generation is going to have to relearn and relearn and relearn these same lessons.
Thank you.
Richard.
John, I want to commend you for this project. One quick comment and a question.
Okay.
The reason it's so important, I think, what you've done is, for years, I will ask Duke conservatives, students who come to me, and I'll say, what are you trying to conserve? And they can't say. They lose their articulate effort. And that has always been interesting to me. Because the liberals, it sounds like they're for liberty. And
Right.
the progressives, it
Progress.
sounds like they're for progress. So they, even the libertarian, they had their ideology in their name. Of course, they're phonies about it. Not the literature. So this is the problem. So the idea of qualifying or adding an adjective. Okay.
That was the idea, yes.
Yeah. The other thing is, I think they're going after the Nats, but maybe also the neo-cons, and there's a whole bunch of them, right? Traditional, cultural, paleo. I
Yes.
think the whole panoply. My question is, that first of all, I think it helps to identify this way. My question is, this is an intramural battle, I think. Maybe you don't see it that way. In other words, we're not trying to convince socialists, environmentalists, feminists. We're trying to convince others conservative. Do you engage with them? Do you debate with the NACCONs? Do you try to persuade them to go in a direction? And my second question is totally foreign policy. One thing about the Trumpian NACCONs, you seem to endorse the idea that we should not be gallivanting all over the world and be policemen of the world. And so I couldn't quite tell in your principles, what is FreeCon's view on U.S. relations abroad?
Well,
Is it more restrictive?
there may be some disagreements about some particular matters.
Yeah.
But I'm fairly certain that free cons are against annexing Canada, stealing Greenland, using the government to create a new Riviera in the Gaza Strip. Okay? I say that cheekily because, yes, there are restrainers in the administration, but I would submit to you that Trump is not one of them. He just has different goals, but is certainly not against using the instruments of government power to acquire territory. Now, I think he's mostly full of stuff on that, but the fact that he's talking that way, I have a good friend who is in the administration, with whom this organization has a long history. And I am fairly certain that he is not feeling great about the restrainer philosophy being associated with someone who seems and talks like such a bully. You would want people who are engaging, you'd want someone who reflects the restrainer philosophy about foreign policy to be friendly, to be looking for opportunities to make mutually advantageous arrangements, not a lot of threats and bluster. So, but you're right to point that there are some disagreements. Let me go back to your first point about the intramural nature of this. It certainly is the case, and sometimes we get criticized, saying, why can't you all just unify against the left? Why do you keep squabbling between the NACCONs and the FreeCons and the TradCons and this and that and the other? So, well, first of all, we, the Freedom Conservatives, we are in fact willing to and actively do work with NACCONs on some issues where we agree. I personally have done that. I've also worked with people on the left when we agree on a few things too, because I think you should always be willing to work with whoever supports the advancement of liberty, okay, and good government and rule of law and all those things. But why in the world would we say we're against the progressive left because they want to make the government too big, they want to concentrate too much power in Washington, they want to regulate business, they want to reinvent antitrust to not be about consumers, but be about protecting some companies that they couldn't compete, and fill in a lot of other blanks. Why would we say we're against all of that and then very happily say we're in the same boat with people who are on the other side of those issues? They are closer to the progressive left. They're not going to ally with the left, fortunately. Well, I should say that's not true. On issues like antitrust, they are in fact explicitly allying with the left. We believe that we cannot succeed unless we, yes, embrace as many different people as possible who agree enough with us, but stand for our principles. And there are just some things, some lines in the sand that we're not going to cross. And when people, including former friends of, that shouldn't sound fair, current friends of mine who I worked with for decades and are now on the other side, I do not see them as like implacable enemies I'm trying to destroy. I think they are deeply misguided. And when I see them, you know what I say to them? I think you are deeply misguided. They sometimes reciprocate and sometimes they just call names. That's okay. As long as they're huffing and puffing and we're actually making our arguments and convincing new people, I'm fine with that. I've had a thick skin for a while. Andy?
It's not explicit in the principles, but one of the things I think that is important to freedom and conservatism, for me at least, is its temperament. It doesn't fit the zeitgeist of the times very well, but I think we're intrinsically optimistic and aspirational.
Yes.
in a way that NACONs and some of the other conservative factions and progressives are not.
We're one election away from complete disaster.
Exactly, and we do look at the past, but we do that because the principles we believe in are timeless, rather than wanting to live, like NACONs in the 1950s or progressives in the 1960s.
As it is often said, the progressives want to work in the 1950s, and the NACONs want to live in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And it turns out you could, unless you have a time machine, you can do neither.
Yeah. I guess to going back to the whole idea of the zeitgeist, that's, I think, one of the principal problems is that, that disposition doesn't quite fit the tenor of the times. Have you found that to be somewhat of an obstacle? Do you have a sense of the way people are feeling generally, as I do, that we seem a little incongruent with the general broader political situation?
Yeah. You're making a good point that it's not necessarily the case. One could believe all of these principles and be rather gloomy. One could believe all these principles and genuinely think that America's almost over or something. But most free cons do not feel that way. We're disappointed in some things, we're worried about some things, we're fundamentally hopeful. We believe the American system has proven itself over time and will continue to succeed. So I think you're right that there is a temperamental difference in addition to a philosophical difference between free cons and our nationalist populist rivals as well as our progressive rivals. I agree with all of that. I don't know. I used to be a good predictor of elections until 2016, and then my record got all messed up. But I have a sense that in 2028, there will be I won't call it a demand for normalcy, like 1920, but something like I want my leaders to be more boring. Might be an actual thing in 2028. They will always have to have a flair for getting attention. I mean, again, the media world works differently and all that, but if you pry yourself away from Washington, which is always a good thing to do, and you look, for example, at state governors around the country, there are a few who are sort of grumpy, stamping their feet kind of people, but not many. And the really popular ones tend to not be that. They tend to be perceived as problem solvers. They tend to be perceived as even-keeled sort of people. That is an appealing thing for government. All other things being equal, gubernatorial candidates do better than Senate candidates, for example, are different. Gubernatorial candidates, when they look like they can be comfortably in charge. I can have him take care of something, I can focus on my family, my life. I think those kind of candidates will do well again in politics, maybe in 28, maybe in 32. And it happens to be the case that many free-con-oriented people who are in public office or want to be in public office tend to have those sorts of dispositions. They don't tend to do a lot of banging the lecture. Well, I guess we'll just have to see. One more question, do you think, or should we call it? I'll take one more question. Go ahead. Make it quick, and I'll have a quick response.
Okay, so of course there is the convincing others of your ideas. But at the end of the day, if you want to spread that freedom conservative movement, you have to actually have political victories. You have to have power.
Yeah.
So are there any shorter, long-term goals in terms of politics, in terms of elections or policies that you have?
Well, we have a lot of free-con policies that are happening all the time. The school choice movement did not start last year or 2 or 3 years ago. It started dozens of years ago. You had to set a lot of background. A lot of us worked on that issue for a long time, setting the stage for what is happening. Deregulation is happening. A lot of things that we like are happening at the state level. Some at the national level, but mostly at the state level. We need to build on that. We need to point to those things. And again, I usually operate in a 501c3 world, and so I don't talk about electoral politics or getting involved myself. I'm an unaffiliated voter. I always have been because I started out as a journalist. Thought it was inappropriate to be, this is very old-fashioned, but I just thought it was inappropriate to be a member of a party if I was a newspaper reporter. A lot of these people who are doing the good thing, the freedom conservatism reforms in state capitals, they're going to run for other things. And I think many of them will succeed, and that will be your political vehicle for something, the political equivalent of the freedom conservative movement happening in national politics. But until then, and all the way through that, and as our first question reminded us, you know, some of them that I like right now, I won't tell you their names, but I think they're doing a good job as a governor. If they became president, some of them would start messing up. They would hire people who get sucked into some of this. This is going to be a never-ending struggle where you finally get somebody who's more friendly to your ideas, and that person is still not going to do it exactly the same way, and we're still going to have to call them on it and hold their feet to the fire. That's just the way self-government works. That's the way the American enterprise has succeeded, and we believe it will succeed in the future. Thank you all very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, I turned it. Well, thank you, John. Obviously, touched on so many important issues, and I was actually thinking about the Trump election and how I think he really won over a big portion of the labor of without that, I wonder if he would have been able to put the coalition together. So I don't know, you can talk about the
Trump's
coalitions.
campaign is a combination
Right.
of free-con sounding principles and that concept. It's not just one.
There you go. But long term, it's not sustainable to do the NatCon thing. At least that's pretty well where our organization would stand, which is more on obviously the classical liberal side. Federalism, what a concept! Wow. So we are going to have a break in September. But in October, we're actually inviting back a FreeCon signatory, which is Dan Garza with Libre. And my understanding is that the Hispanic community is really pro-entrepreneurship. And Dan is I haven't heard him talk, but I heard he's a really engaging speaker. So I'm really excited about that. And that's going to be, all of our events are on the second Wednesday of the month, except for December, and really because of some of the financial constraints, we had to decide about how frequently we were going to have some of our meetings. So normally we would have had September, October, November, and then start up January through June and take off July and August. Just keep your eye on the website, and then in November we will have a very interesting man, Greg Bolin, who's an entrepreneur extraordinaire, and it's really nice when we have folks from the business community, and he's a venture capitalist. He started over 60 companies. He basically he brought Netflix and Blue Rhino to market, which is no small feat. So please do donate and go to the AIR website, and thank you very much for coming.